as I said, I just couldn't leave it at this. So I wrote them a second rebuttal. In it, I asked, and actually I begged them, to please address my research work point by point and explain which point they disagreed with and why, so that I can respond to those points individually in a constructive dialogue. Did they disagree with my conclusion that the GBC was no longer executing these duties? And if so, state why they disagree, and let's discuss it. But actually, Hridayananda Maharaj had actually admitted that they were no longer following these duties, because he had stated that if they were to restore those functions and duties back to the GBC, that it would reduce the gurus to that of Ritviks. So they didn't disagree to that point. But then I further asked them, did they disagree with my conclusion that not performing those duties constitutes a drastic change in how the GBC were managing the movement? If they disagreed with that assessment, I asked that they please state why, and let's discuss that point. But actually, during the North American GBC meetings back in 1990, when I requested the GBC's help in restoring the Fate Museum project, the GBC members told me back then in 1990 that the system that Srila Prabhupada had set up had totally changed, and that the GBC no longer functioned as it was when Srila Prabhupada was present. So basically, the GBC had already answered that question also. Then I asked if they disagreed with my point that did these changes constitute a violation of Srila Prabhupada's written order, and it's actually written and verbal order, to not change the system he had set up? Did the GBC disagree with that point? If so, to state why, and let's discuss that. I begged them for an intelligent, academic, and meaningful, constructive dialogue and discussion based on the merits of these points I had put forward. When Hridayananda wrote me his response, which he told me was on behalf of the full GBC, he hadn't recited any scripture or quoted any instructions given by Srila Prabhupada supporting their position that to take these functions and duties away from the gurus would render them to be no more than that of a ceremonial priest. I asked them to back up that statement with evidence from Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, and to allow me to debate it with them. I had already given the argument that Srila Prabhupada himself had stopped performing those very same duties and functions for his own disciples, and yet he hadn't been reduced to that of a ceremonial priest. I asked that if they had any issue with that assessment, to please state what it is and allow me to debate this with them. All they had done was just to throw a bad label on me, basically call me a name, a bad name, make false allegations against me, and use those false allegations as justification for throwing my paper out in the trash, and justify why they didn't have to debate the points in a sober and constructive way. Their behavior and response was completely unacceptable, and it was not at all Vaishnav-like. It was totally unbefitting anyone who was in an important position of formally representing Srila Prabhupada and his mission. In my view, they were acting like fanatics rather than qualified leaders of a spiritual and philosophically based mission. I was also disturbed that they took issue with and attacked the title and theme of my original article, which was, "The system of management shall continue as it is. There is no need of any change." The GBC had taken direct issue with that title and called it a divisive trick that I was trying to use to trick the GBC into reducing the gurus to become no more than that of a ceremonial priest, a Ritvik. But the title was spoken and by Srila Prabhupada himself. It is a written instruction given by ISKCON's founder, Acharya. It is not Amayatma Das's words or ideas that they were rejecting and taking issue with. This was directly Srila Prabhupada's own words and his direct instruction to them, the GBC.
The system of management will go on as it is now. There is no need of changing.
When I sent my second rebuttal, I made that point clear. The way I saw this was that the GBC had become defiant, not against my ideas, but I saw that they were becoming defiant, that they were defiantly rejecting Srila Prabhupada. I had given, in my view, clear and definitive evidence that they were in violation of this instruction by Srila Prabhupada, that the system should not have been changed, that these duties should not have been taken away from the GBC. And all I was doing is asking that they undo the changes so that they will again be compliant and obedient to the desire and instructions given by His divine grace. In my view, adhering to Srila Prabhupada's direct instructions was far more important than these men upholding their guru-like outward public appearance. They cared more about how they would be seen as gurus than in how they were obeying Srila Prabhupada. Their one and only argument for rejecting my paper was that if they gave all these duties back to the GBC, the gurus would become no more than Ritvik. I asked for scriptural evidence of this. Srila Prabhupada had given up these same duties, yet he didn't become a Ritvik. On what basis were they making that claim? I had given evidence that their claim was baseless, so please, if they still disagreed, please discuss this point with me more. It was my unmoving conclusion that it was imperative that the GBC perform the duties that Srila Prabhupada had prescribed them. That was fundamental. That was their first and primary and foremost duty. Where that left the gurus, in my view, that was secondary. And I made it a point that until they correct their own position by restoring the GBC's duties and correcting their violation of this order by Srila Prabhupada to not change that system that he had set up, until they correct this, there was no use in them trying to address the guru issue. I told them that first they had to correct their own disobedience to Srila Prabhupada's order, restore the system as it was before they changed it. And then the GBC will have the spiritual strength to deal with the guru issue and any other issue that is facing them, but not before they correct their own errant ways. I told them that I had no interest at that time, and at least I had no interest in supporting the Ritvik Ras side. And I didn't even want to discuss that issue at the time. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, whatever action is performed by a great man, common men follow in his footsteps. And whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. Bhagavad Gita 3:21. My point I made to them was that if the leaders themselves have a flagrant disregard for a most important instruction given to them by Srila Prabhupada, and that was that the system of management that he had spent 7 years setting up was not to have changed, that these GBC men were setting the worst example for the society to follow. Such so-called leadership will totally destroy Srila Prabhupada's mission. In regards to performing one's duties, Krishna says, it is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though they may be faulty, than another's duties. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. Bhagavad Gita 3:35. The duties and functions that are shown on the screen from time to time were prescribed by Srila Prabhupada to the GBC for them to carry out within his mission for the members of ISKCON. They were to be carried out as GBC members, not as gurus. They were specifically to apply for after he departed. In my research, I found no instruction by Srila Prabhupada that the GBC was to ever stop performing any of these duties and were to hand them over to any new gurus. There is no such instruction. He had assigned the GBC these duties, and specifically and explicitly so that they would continue to perform those same duties after he departed. That was the whole purpose of setting up the GBC and handing over these duties to them in the first place. Therefore, these duties had to be returned back to the GBC. I also pointed out that to give up those duties and have the gurus perform them instead totally changed the way ISKCON was managed, and that this was creating additional problems all over the society. Well, a guru can perform those functions, as Srila Prabhupada did in the early years. They are not what defines a guru. By Srila Prabhupada's own example, we see that a real and true guru doesn't have to perform those functions. Srila Prabhupada himself stopped performing them for his own disciples and requested the GBC to perform them on his behalf for the members of ISKCON. Yet he remained the Diksha Guru for both his existing and future disciples. He was not reduced to that of a ceremonial ritvik priest just because he no longer performed those functions for his disciples. That was the one and only argument that they had given, and it was baseless. And I again emphasize this in my third rebuttal. I begged them, if they disagreed, please give the reason why, and let's discuss this further in a philosophical mood rather than fanatically throwing labels and name-calling and refusing to engage in an intellectual discussion. I then sent, I think it was my third rebuttal by then, and hoping that this time I would finally get an intellectual and constructive response.